ask anything, or if you prefer to write your question down, we can do it that way as well. And it can be any question at all. It doesn't have to be about the topic that I spoke about. It can be anything that's kind of crossing your mind at this moment.
Where are you from?
Where am I from? I was afraid he was going to ask, what's the weather like outside? Well, I was born and raised here in the U.S. Originally, my parents are from Egypt. All right, any other relevant or irrelevant questions? I'm kidding. Any other questions?
You said you were going to speak briefly on multiple wives of Islam, but I don't think
you did. Yes, thank you. Yes, I think the phone call threw me off a little. But yes, I did mention that I was going to discuss that because that's always a question that comes up on talks about women. Again, we have to understand the historical context of when the advent of Islam came during that time period. During the Jahiliyyah, which is the pre-Islamic period in Arabia, many men practiced multiple marriages. And there was no limit to the number of wives that a man could have. So that idea of the harem that we see today, if you've read 1001 Lovely Nights or Lonely Nights, or what is it, 1001 Nights? So yes, okay, there you go, 1001 Nights. I have to add the adjective there, lovely or lonely or whatever type of nights they were 1001 nights. If you've read that book, you know that in there's this king who has a harem of many beautiful women. This isn't very far from the truth. At that time in Arabia, men could have an unlimited amount of wives, and they did. And they treated those wives like property rather than people. So with the advent of Islam, the limit of a man being allowed to have 4 wives was actually a restriction upon what was already happening at that time. And the restriction came in a way in order to provide women their rights. So one of the reasons why it is limited to 4 wives, for example, is that each wife is required, and this continues today, but again, it's one of the women's rights that sometimes is not talked about in many countries, but every wife is required to have, has the right, I shouldn't say required, has the right to have sexual relations with her husband at least once every 4 nights. Okay? And a husband cannot refuse that interaction. Okay? Because often what we see in popular culture and popular renditions today of that frame Islam, the idea is that the woman has no rights and the man can ask for his physical rights to be responded to at any time, any day of the week. But this was one of the constructs, that a woman would have the right every 4 days to have intimate relations. Another construct was the right to owning property, right to inheritance, and that right to the limit. A woman also has the right of refusal. So if a husband cannot marry a second wife and say behind his wife's back, or just tell his current wife, I'm going to go marry someone else, the woman actually has the right to seek a divorce from her husband if she chooses not to be a co-wife. The other interesting thing with this construct of the 4 wives, so again, the historical context is that this was a restriction limiting the number of wives that a man could have, not increasing it as it's seen today. However, today, of course, because polygamy here in the US is not practiced, and in many places elsewhere, of course, it's not practiced, it's something that's looked down upon, we see it as 4 wives is so many. Why would a man want 4 wives? I would have to ask that question as well in our current economy, in our current situation. But the reality is that a man cannot marry a second wife or take on a co-wife until meeting some very, very particular requirements. One of which is that each wife, if a man chooses to marry a second wife or a co-wife, each wife must be treated exactly the same. Okay? So if the first wife gets a Mercedes, then wife number 2 and number 3 and number 4 better all have Mercedes. If the first wife gets a home, the second wife and the third wife have to have their own home. So the treatment has to be completely equal. The time must be divided equally between the wives. So if you're spending Monday with one, Tuesday has to be with the other, Wednesday, Thursday, so on and so forth. So time must be divided equally, objects must be divided equally. There's also a narration from the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, that says the heart must also treat more than one wife equally. And we know this is very, very difficult, and it's a requirement. So one cannot have greater feelings towards one wife as opposed to the other. Or if they do have greater feelings, it's like your children. You can't have one child that you love more than the other and tell all the other children, well, I love your brother more than you. Or else you're going to need years of therapy for that. But, and so with the wives, it's the same thing. So what most scholars say today is that in order to meet those restrictions or requirements, it's practically impossible It's practically impossible for a man to truly be able to meet all of those requirements. And this doesn't even go into the fact that the man must have reasons for wanting a co-wife or a second wife, okay? Also, another important thing to realize in terms of context is that at the time of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, many men were killed in wars, and women were left with children as widows, and these women were not individuals who could support themselves. They didn't have jobs. They couldn't just go get a job, in the local Macy's or something and support themselves. And so they needed to have men who could also help in terms of financial support. And so this was, again, a practice that allowed for that right of women to be protected and still limit so that women were no longer being collected like harems or, put into a trophy case. So the women still had their rights, but the concept, the construct of the multiple wives still existed in a functional aspect. So today, if it is being overused or misused, then again, it's not a construct of Islam, because there are very specific reasons when a man can take on a second wife, and there are very specific ways of dealing with multiple wives. So I hope that answers the question there. Okay, there's a written question here, and it says, what would you say to a convert to Islam who is struggling with prayer? I would say the same thing that I would say to a person who was born as a Muslim, born into the faith, and who's struggling with prayer. That we all have our struggles. We all have our difficulties in life. But we all have to realize that we're given the tools and the capacity to overcome our struggles with the help of God. But we can't not turn to Him. We have to turn to Him. We have to seek His help. We have to seek His guidance. And we also have to sometimes change our perspective. So for those of you who are not familiar with the prayer in Islam, that we of course pray 5 times a day. Each prayer takes about 5 or 6 minutes. If you're truly going to give it its time, then you'll take 10 minutes. But usually about 5 or 6 minutes is what it takes. But it's difficult sometimes to be able to connect with it. And sometimes because prayer becomes so ritualistic, and you might see this, you're squeezing it in between classes, and you're going through the motions. You're like, Allahu Akbar, and you're moving up and down, and it becomes just a ritual motion. But in reality, this isn't what prayer should be like. That our prayer in Islam is actually a gift to us, not a gift to God, because God doesn't need our prayer. We need that prayer. So when we enter prayer, the proper way of entering prayer is that when we lift our hands to say Allahu Akbar, we're supposed to be making a commitment with God. We're not saying Allahu Akbar, although it's translated in English as God is great. The true translation of it is God is greater than. And when you lift your hands and you say Allahu Akbar, God is greater than, what are you saying God is greater than? It's everything that you're throwing behind you. So as you lift your hands in this movement, you're throwing the world behind you. You're putting behind you, that test that you just failed, that relationship that just went awry, that situation that you had with your mother. You're putting it all behind you. And you're entering into a conversation with God. And to have those 5 or 6 minutes in your life, 5 times a day, when you know that it's just you and God, that you're connecting, that no matter what else is going around you, you're in this one-on-one office hours with your Creator. Wow. That's really powerful. And when you exit your prayer, when you're done with your prayer, and you've done it with that true conviction, you have that feeling of anticipation. You can't wait for the next prayer because you want to have that gift again in your life. And so many times we'll put more emphasis on taking a smoking break, or stopping out, when you've had a long day at work and you got to step out for a cup of coffee. But if only we knew the power of prayer across faiths. I have a good friend of mine who's an evangelical Christian. And, I've nicknamed her the prayer warrior because she's very obsessive with prayers, And she'll always say that no matter what she's doing, where she's at, what situation she's going through, it's prayer that gets her through. And so for us as Muslims, we have that built into our daily lives. So it's not just pray when you feel bad, pray when you're sick, pray when things aren't going right. It's pray, 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 pray 5 times a day. And then pray extra, because it is a gift for us when we do it with that conviction and that connection to God that is part of our purpose on earth. And again, across faith, you can see that connection to prayer when it's really done with that idea in mind. All right, so why can a man marry another or more than one woman, especially after divorce, while a woman has more restrictions? Okay, that is a very good question that's being asked here. And And again, we have to look at both the historical context and the religious context here. The practice of polyamory, which was women marrying more than one man, was also rampant in the Jahiliyyah. So across certain tribes, at the time of prior to the advent of Islam, women could marry more than one man. Okay? Again, not sure why someone would want to, but that was happening there. Okay? Women were marrying more than one man. And during that time, what was happening with these women is that there were huge issues of paternity. Children were being born, and it was a matriarchal society in those tribes, but children were born not knowing who their father was, not knowing which of the many husbands was truly their father. Okay? Obviously, in a situation where a man marries more than one woman, there will be no question about maternity because there's only one womb that a child is coming from. Okay? So that was the first issue. The other issue in those societies, the societies of matriarchy, was that there was a lot of issues in terms of gender relations, gender stature, essentially. So that in Islam, for example, we have an ayah in the Quran that says, الرجال قوامون على النساء, which means the men are the protectors of the women. So even from that time, there was a natural tendency for men to have that protecting role, to have that role. And even when we look at the Wadobi tribe that I mentioned earlier, although women are seen as functional and men are seen as beautiful, there is still that concept of the men being more of the protector in a relationship situation. So today, when we look at why a woman can't marry a man, it's definitely because more than one man. It's because of issues of paternity. It's because of issues of the downfall of the matriarchal society anywhere in the world. Okay? And that has a lot of social and then a lot of things that we could delve into in deeper context at another time. But also, just going back to the fact that when you look at the history of the situation, it was men who, there weren't enough men, but there were more women. And if you look at our society today, in our populations, the number of women actually outnumbers the number of men. So if a woman were to marry more than one man, again, from a population perspective, that wouldn't work. But in all of these things, these are just social explanations for us to try to grasp it and understand it. But the reality is that it is a commandment from God that a woman marries one man. What are your feelings, thoughts on the burqa from a historical and present-day context? Okay, another good question. The burqa, as I explained earlier, is worn in different areas. In Oman, the burqa is prevalent in Afghanistan, in Yemen, and the burqa is different than the niqab, and different than the khimar, and different than the hijab. The burqa is usually brown or gray in color, and it covers the entire body, including the eyes, with something that looks almost like a mesh cage over the eyes. Okay? The niqab, which we see in Saudi Arabia, is all black, and often there will be an opening for the eyes, or the eyes can also be covered and then uncovered as a woman moves from the area to area. The khimar, as I mentioned, is often seen in Egypt, in areas of Syria, and it's, again, long covering, long loose dress, with a covering that covers, often the woman will wear gloves, and a long covering that covers up to the knees. Okay? And the hijab is what I'm wearing now, which is the covering that is loose clothing. It can be Western style clothing, or it can be Eastern style clothing, as long as it's clothing that's loose, that doesn't necessarily show the shape of the body, and that only the face and the hands are showing. So, many scholars believe that at the time of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, and then this is narrated, the wives of the Prophet wore niqab, which means they wore the black. It was the complete covering. So not necessarily the burqa, but something more similar to the burqa than what I'm wearing now. Okay? And it was said that the wives of the Prophet wore the niqab so that they would be known and would not be harassed. Okay? So that people would know these are the wives of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him. So for many women today, those who choose to wear niqab, they choose to do so as a form of getting closer to God, of feeling that connection even more, of truly not having any of the physical be important, making all of the physical irrelevant. Okay? For me personally, I would find it difficult, probably living in this country, to be able to work in the college atmosphere, to be able to give lectures, to be able to speak while wearing the niqab. However, I do understand that if it is as a choice, if a woman chooses to wear it, then that's something that must be respected, because it's something that the woman feels is her connection to God, to getting closer to God. Okay? And the same goes to the burqa. Unfortunately, what we see in Saudi Arabia and Afghanistan and Oman and Yemen is that it's often not a choice for the women. That many of these women are forced to wear it by the government, they're forced to wear it by their fathers, by their brothers. And one of the important tenets of Islam is that there is no compulsion in the religion. No one can be forced to practice the religion. Not by a father, not by the government, okay? So there shouldn't be force. Because what happens a lot of times, and I see this often in Saudi Arabia, women will wear the niqab when they're out and about because they have to, or otherwise the police will arrest them or harass them. But as soon as they get onto a plane to another country, everything comes off, you know what I mean? Like everything, you know? And it's because it's not done out of conviction. It's not done out of obedience to God. It's being done out of obedience to a government figure or the state's laws. And that's personally, again, where I would discourage, you know, if somebody is doing it because they're giving in to someone else's command and not because they're for the sake of God, then it shouldn't be done. Because in our religion, there is no compulsion. All right, what is the Islamic view of transgender women? This is an interesting question, and I don't have a lot of knowledge in this area, so I'm going to share what I know. But again, you know, I would encourage you to look into it further. In Yemen, and there's an interesting book that was written about this topic. I think it's actually called The Third Gender. In Yemen, there is this idea of a third gender, of individuals who are, in appearance, they look like men, but they physically have the attributes of women. Okay? And also individuals who are hermaphrodites, who might have both gender, physical in there, and things like that. And in Yemen, that third gender is treated as if they are women, so they're allowed to, you know, hang out with the women, they're allowed to socialize with the women, they actually sing at women's weddings. But this is a very cultural construct. Islamically speaking, if we're looking at transgender as somebody who is elected to change their gender, who has gone through surgery in order to become a different gender, then this is against the religion because you're changing the creation that God has made you in, the form that God has made you in. However, if you're a child who is born with two genders, with the physical representation of two genders, this makes it a little bit more difficult, and this is the part that I can't speak to. Because I am sure that in a situation where a parent, you know, gives birth to a child, and the child has both genders, they're going to have to choose one or the other. And in choosing one or the other, there's probably always that fear of, you know, did I choose the right one? And so that's the part that I don't want to speak to because I'm not knowledgeable in it, but I do like this question, and this is the first time I've been asked about it, so I will definitely be looking into it and trying to find an answer. So if whoever asked this question wants to email me, I will try to research it and ask the scholars that I usually refer back to when I have things that I don't know how to answer, and I will try to get back to you on that. Okay, would wearing a hijab or a covering outside of Islam be considered offensive? And that's an excellent question. And I would say, you know, if we look at the back here, the girls were saying earlier they have a hijab on for the day, you know. I think it's commendable for anyone who wants to practice modesty. I think it's commendable to outwardly, you know, express modesty, even if you haven't made that connection from an Islamic perspective, and you don't feel like, you know, so I was mentioning how in Islam, the religion is integrated in all parts of our lives. So on my phone, I have the adhan, which is the call for prayer. And I can't tell you how many times it's gone off at random moments. But I prefer to keep it on because it is that reminder for me that it's time to pray. So we'll wrap up the questions so that we can make it for prayer time. So no, it definitely would not be offensive for a woman to wear hijab, even if she's not a Muslim, because it's her form of practicing modesty. I actually have a friend who is a Hasidic Jew. And she lives in Lakewood, New Jersey, which is a population that has many Hasidic Jewish individuals there. I met her by speaking on a panel, an interfaith panel of different women. And at the time, she was wearing the wig. In the Jewish faith, women are also, Hasidic Jewish women, Orthodox Jewish women, are supposed to cover their hair as well as a means of modesty. However, in recent years, women have opted to wear wigs rather than scarves because they feel like it's more modern, it's more popular, but they're still covering their hair. And after we had met several times and we had spoken together, she began adopting the hijab and wearing the hijab like this because she felt like this was closer to the interpretation of what her own faith was telling her she should do. And I know she got a lot of backlash for dressing in this way, but it was a choice that she made because she felt like it gave her that feeling of modesty more than just wearing the wig. All right, what does Islam say about polyandry and what are the reasons? We talked about this a little bit, so hopefully that answered your question earlier. In my experience, many, not all, of the Muslim men who come here stray from the teachings of Islam, drinking and other things, but the women don't. Why? Do women have a stricter set of rules? Are women punished more harshly? Do women have more self-control than men? It seems that it's a fear, out of fear of strict rule or worldly punishment controls, more than just the love of Islam. Okay, that's a very good question, and I think it comes into play that culture often gets mixed up with religion. And we will see here in the US oftentimes that culturally speaking, parents will be more lax with their boys. So if a boy goes out with a girl, he goes gets a cup of coffee, it might just be like, oh, it's okay. It's not going to affect his chances of getting married, so it's fine, we'll let it slide. If a woman, for instance, if a young college student, a female Muslim girl, gets an email from a guy, and that same parent might see that email, oh, it's like the end of the world, right? This is not Islam. This is not Islam. Our religion preaches that equality. That ayah, that verse from the Quran that I talked to you about, talks about the equality between men and women. That it is that your deeds, your actions, that you are judged upon. So whether you're a man or a woman, you need to adhere to the tenets of Islam. It's not, for some people it may be out of fear, but my personal feeling, and again, I view Islam as something that's so central to my life. My personal feeling is, why wouldn't I want to practice Islam? Why wouldn't I want to please my Creator? And for me, it's a personal connection for why I practice my Islam. But for everyone, I guess everyone has their own reasons. All right, we've got 2 more questions. I think I can take them quickly before, okay. Can I continue or do we need to stop for prayer? 2 more questions? Okay, I'll try to run through them quickly. I know I'm giving like a novel answer for each one. I'll try to answer with a yes or no, okay? What is your opinion on makeup? Is it considered as changing you? Okay, again, the concept of hijab, the idea of hijab is modesty. It's taking away from the physical focus so that you're not so focused on the physical. Do we live in a world that tries to sell us products that beautify us? Do we get sucked in sometimes to, that cute new shade of blush or, that light lip liner that just kind of makes our lip look nicer? Of course, we all get sucked into it. We can't be completely turned away from it. Again, if this is your struggle, and if you feel like this is something that you want to overcome, that it's taking you away from your purpose, then that's something that you should work on. All right, who could play the most important role for the girls for wearing hijab? What appears most, parents or Islamic centers? I think today, in terms of role models for young girls, back in the day we used to say it starts in the home. Now I feel like, it starts on YouTube, it starts on Facebook, it starts online. Our young girls are being so affected by what they see in the internet, essentially. And I think as much as we may try to build that home for our children, where we try to keep them kind of enclosed or, try not to expose them to the world, that's not healthy, and it's not happening either because they're going to find a way, But really having open dialogue. So if your child, if your daughter, your teenager, your preteen is watching, I don't know what's out there now, Gilmore Girls, or is that old? Okay. I don't know. I don't know what Glee. I don't know what's out there these days. But whatever popular show happens to be out there right now, and your daughter is watching it, and you can tell that she's being influenced by it. Have a conversation. Open up the dialogue. Let your home be the place where your child wants to come talk to you. And I can say this. I have a 13-year-old now, and I have a 10-year-old and a 6-year-old. And I know, for instance, when my 6-year-old comes into the car after school, after kindergarten, she's all full of words like, Mom, so-and-so dropped her crayon, and I tried to pick it up, but then she took it from me, and then, she said it was my crayon, but I told her, no, it was my crayon. And sometimes I have to stop myself from just being like, I have to be like, so wait, what color was the crayon? And what did you draw with the crayon? And the reason why I realize this is because, I see it with my 10-year-old and my 13-year-old, when they come in the car and I'm like, how was school? And they're like, fine. I'm like, oh, to have those days when they wanted to tell me about the crayon, And it's important for us to keep that dialogue open. So sometimes it's about asking the right questions. So I realized that I can't, I can ask my kindergarten, how was your day? And I get a perfect play-by-play of everything she did that day, including, when she went to the bathroom and how much she went, and everything. Whereas when I ask my older daughter, how was school today, I'm just gonna get a fine. So it's about asking the right questions. So I know when my daughter comes out of her middle school, 7th grade is a tough year, man. She comes out of 7th grade, the last thing she wants to talk about is how was school. What she wants to talk about is what her friend told her, or what this one might have been wearing, or who did this, or what. And those are the types of questions that I've learned to ask. So have that dialogue, open up the conversation, and then we can go back to being that influence in our children's lives. How can we motivate our girls towards hijab? Oh good, I like when it's the same question twice. So I think that same answer goes, just having that dialogue, having those conversations, being aware, and creating the atmosphere that's conducive for our girls to step away from what the media is telling them is important, and to learn what's important for them. Modeling the behavior, not being the type of mom who, is on the phone and might tell someone, oh yes, I'm so busy, I have a million things to do today, and then hangs up and then goes watches TV. And then when the child might repeat the same thing, you wonder why. So being that active role model for the children, exhibiting what you'd like your child to exhibit as well, and truly making your child love the home and loving the parents. All right, so I think we'll wrap it up here so that we have enough time for prayer. I am still around for a little bit longer, so feel free to come, ask me questions, informally talk. I have my business cards on this table here. I also have some of my books that I'm selling. If you're interested in looking at them, you're welcome to do so. Thank you once again for inviting me. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Everyone, the bathrooms, if you want to do a group for prayer, they're down that way. We're going to do prayer it's 7:45 right now. We're going to do prayer. It's going to start at 8, okay? So just everyone who has to do wudu has time for that, okay? Prayer is going to be in the back. There's sheets in the back.